I'm John Alden Bushnell, Generation 12, and I'm sitting here in the entrance to Pearson College and Yale University, which is where I lived for 3 years while I was at Yale. Freshman year, I stayed at the old campus. I was born in July of 1933 on Long Island in Glen Cove. My parents were living in Oyster Bay. They then, when I was about 7, moved to Goshen, Connecticut, and then to Winsted, Connecticut in less than a year. And I grew up in Winsted, Connecticut, went to Gilbert High School, and graduated valedictorian of my class in 1951. And because I had a good scholastic record, I won a Nesbitt scholarship to Yale, which paid most of the costs of coming here to Yale. And I went from sort of one lucky break to another. And as my senior year, when I was planning what I would go next, I thought I might go to business school, or actually, I was in ROTC, Air Force ROTC, so I thought I would be, at the time of the Korean War, that I would be called up to active duty. But my roommates here at Yale, just behind me in what we call the slave quarters, which was where we were living in the senior year, some of the nicest accommodations in Yale, were looking at what they were going to do because they weren't in ROTC, so they were about to be drafted if they didn't go to graduate school or do something like that. So they were looking for some kind of foreign scholarship or a US scholarship or something, and they brought all the booklets home, and they said, hey John, you're the economist, which one of these makes sense? So I looked at a couple of them. I said, well, look at the Fulbright. You apply for the project, they pay your way there, they pay your university course, they give you living expenses, and they pay your way back. Now, what's wrong with that? Nobody could see anything wrong with it. So they said, well, John, why don't you apply for one? And I couldn't think of any reason for not applying, so I did. And I put together my application, and when you apply for a Fulbright, you have to have a project that you want to do in a foreign country where you want to go to study. And so I decided that I wanted to go to Australia. I went to the library and I spent an afternoon studying up on Australia and getting some numbers and so forth, and came up with the theory of where their economic development was, and said I wanted to study that. Made my application and sent it off. That was about November. And I didn't hear anything. So after it got to be about March, I figured, well, they're not calling me for an interview even, so I guess that's the end of that. And the next thing I know, about April 1st, I get a telegram. There were telegrams in those days. It said, you sail September 10th from San Francisco. So I had this, so I went to the Air Force and I said, can I go on this Fulbright? They said, certainly, you can go in the Air Force after that. So I went to Australia, and I had nearly 2 years in Australia, very nice. 1956 Olympics were in Melbourne where I was, so I was able to go to a number of the Olympic events, and I did the study that, not the study I planned to do, but a different study that made more sense. I had lots of friends, had a great time in Australia, made my way back after a couple of years very slowly, traveling through Asia, India, Iran, the Middle East, Greece, and finally the Air Force caught up with me and ordered me to active duty, and they asked me where I was, and I said in my schedule in 6 weeks I was going to be in Rome, so they said report to active duty in Rome. So I went to the embassy in Rome, I found the air attaché, and he gave me a ticket to Paris, and they had booked me on a plane to fly back to the US, and I went, after a couple of days in Connecticut, I went to Texas, and I was in the Air Force, Dyess Air Force Base, for 20 months. I benefited from a nice new program they had, because they had I was in the Strategic Air Command, and they had a program when they rated every base, and the officers who were running a base that did real well on this rating, which had about 500 different points they rated, got promoted, and the others who were generally colonels got retired. So I helped we were very low. When I went in, our base was about next to last. And the poor base commander was really sweating that his career was over. But I was able to massage the system a little bit and get it going. And finally I finished first. And he said, what do you want? Do you want to be a regular officer? You want to get promoted? What do you want? No, I said, I want to get out. I want to get on with my life. So he said, well, I can do that too. So I got out early. And when I went to be mustered out, the sergeant said to me, well, Lieutenant Bushnell, where do you want to go? I said, well, where am I entitled to go? And he says, well, it says here you reported to active duty from Melbourne, Australia. Take no place further than that. You can go any place you want. So they gave me a nice ticket. I flew in the air with the Air Force to Honolulu and then with Pan American back to Melbourne because I hadn't finished the book I was working on, and I spent another 4 months there in 1959. While I was in Australia the first time, I was dating an Australian girl, and she said to me, what do you want to do and so forth? And I said, well, I think it'd be nice to live in a place like Australia where things are relatively cheap and make an American salary. And she said, well, why don't you join the State Department, be a diplomat? Her father was the publisher of the newspaper in Perth, Australia, and she said they are able to go out in their boats in the afternoon and play golf on Wednesday afternoon. It's a great life. So I said, well, I'll give that a try. So I wrote to the State Department and said, how do I do that? And they said, well, you have to take an 8-hour exam and you have to take an oral exam. And so I began to do that. I took the written exam in Melbourne. And I did, when I was in the Air Force, I went to Dallas and took the oral exam. And they said I passed, and as soon as there was a vacancy, I would come in. But once I got out of the Air Force, they still weren't having any vacancies, so I was back in Australia studying there. And I had my route planned home. I was going to take a ship and get off with Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and then go up through India and stay for 3 or 4 weeks in Kashmir, finish up the work I was doing on the book, and then go to Europe for a while. And when I went to the embassy in Colombo, in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, they had a letter for me from the State Department which says, you report to duty November 8th, which was like in 8 weeks. So I canceled my trip to Kashmir, I've never been to Kashmir, and caught the same ship I got off of in Colombo, in Bombay, and sailed back through the Suez Canal in Europe, and I was able to spend 3 weeks in Europe, touring around a little bit, came back and went to work for the State Department, where I had a marvelous career. While I was in the first 3 years of my Foreign Service career, I was stationed in Washington, and the second summer, I went up to visit one of my college roommates from Yale, who had with some of his friends a cottage, a big cottage on the shore in New Jersey. And while there, his girlfriend brought in another girl so we could have a fourth for bridge. And she seemed like a pretty nice girl, so I began dating her. And that turned into the love of my life. And I married Anne Morell in 1962. And then she joined me on all the foreign assignments and in everything since, including doing this DVD. We served in Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica. 1 son each was born in each of these places. And then Switzerland. And we had 12 consecutive years in Washington when I was at the National Security Council, Treasury Department, the State Department. Finally, at the end of the period, I was the Acting Assistant Secretary for Latin America in charge of all Latin American affairs. And then we went to Buenos Aires for 5 years. And later, I went for the best part of a year to Panama at the time when we had the invasion. And after Panama, I was back in the State Department and then retired from the State Department. And practically the next week, went to work for the District Attorney of New York, which I did part-time for 17 years until I finally retired. And we left our house, which we've been in since 1971 in McLean, and moved to a condo in Leesburg, where we live to this day.